Viewing the multitude of articles exposed for sale in the marketplace, Socrates remarked, "How many things there are that I do not want," and felt himself rich in his poverty. Thus the historian Will Durant quotes Diogenes Laertius, a biographer writing about Socrates the Athenian in the 3rd century AD. Hello and welcome to the Western Traditions Podcast. My name is Rob Paxton, and this is the 29th episode of The Greek Sun, a series of podcasts about ancient Greek history and culture. Today, I introduce you to one of the most famous men in our Western traditions, Socrates of Athens. Without Socrates, it is possible that the West would have never integrated its disparate pagan and Christian roots, would have never harmonized its two ancient minds, would have never sustained itself against the great tests of the barbarian invasions, the Viking raids, and the Muslim onslaughts. The West would have instead fragmented and left its scattered members to be absorbed by enemies from the north, the east, and the south. Now, how Socrates becomes the linchpin to the foundations of Western civilization is something that will play out over the course of the next several years of podcast episodes. Today's episode will be merely another step in a very long encounter with the soul of our Western traditions. Before we begin that encounter, please remember to check out the website at western-traditions.org. That's western-traditions.org. Wherever you listen, on Spotify, Player FM, Amazon Music, or elsewhere, please remember to like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment. You can also visit the shopping page on my website and buy some Western Traditions merchandise or contribute directly to the support of the podcast through PayPal or Patreon. We do not know much about Socrates in terms of his biography. If we only had Plato to rely on as a source, we would do right in suspecting that Socrates never existed, that he is just a useful mouthpiece for Plato's own philosophy expressed through his dialogues. But there are other sources. Xenophon, whose military adventures we will come to in a few episodes, also writes of Socrates the Athenian, as someone whose wisdom was to be consulted, if not actually followed. And of course, Aristophanes, whose plays we will also come to in a few episodes, publicly ridicules Socrates and his ideas. Others also speak of Socrates the Athenian, and often in a disparaging manner, without lightening the blow with comedy as Aristophanes did. Aristoxenus of Tarentum, for example, reports hearing about Socrates from his late father, who characterized this world-famous philosopher as an uneducated, ignorant, debauched man. Now, no one believes that everything written about Socrates, either good or bad, is true, but the man existed, and he was apparently loved by some and hated by others. Some say that his father was a sculptor, others that he came from a slave family. This latter seems unlikely, though, since our most reliable information about the man describes him fighting as a hoplite in the Peloponnesian War. If you listened already to my episode on Athens, then you know that hoplites generally came from upper or upper middle class families, since they had to be wealthy enough to purchase armor and weapons. The military feats of Socrates were well regarded, and he is depicted as being the last Athenian to fall back at the Battle of Delium from the onslaught of the Spartans, who feared his battle prowess. Sometimes writers or speakers will try to play up Socrates' valor and turn him into a new Achilles or something. I think that these speakers are rather compensating, probably unintentionally, for the etherealness of philosophy, perhaps trying to ground the man and make him familiar to an audience of people with more mundane backgrounds. I myself, I do not doubt Socrates' valor. It's just that if you read enough Greek history, you know that personal valor was basic to the Athenian character. I am sure Socrates was a good warrior, but so was everyone in this corner of the space-time continuum. So let's just grant Socrates an honorable military service and move on. He married a woman named Xanthippe, who is mentioned briefly in the Phaedo, Plato's dialogue about the death of Socrates. Socrates was also considered to be rather ugly, and truthfully, the busts of the man that remain, they fare poorly when placed side by side with the more noble features of, say, a Pericles or a Cimon. He appears usually as a balding, bearded, heavy-set man with crude features. At some point in his life, anyway, Socrates began to turn to philosophy. Most likely, throughout his life, he was surrounded by sophists, a breed of philosopher who invaded Athens when Socrates was young. Now, Socrates is definitely identified as among the sophists, but he actually verbally sparred with them frequently. He is perhaps best defined by his opposition to virtually all other philosophers, and in particular, the sophists. And his opposition comes in the form of admitting his own ignorance. As we will see in the dialogues of Plato, Socrates frequently insists that he knows nothing, and also shows that all those who profess to know something are equally ignorant. The sophists, you see, were distinct from the philosophers about whom I spoke in the first episode on Greek philosophy, the pre-Socratics, as we call them. They were mostly interested in matters such as what everything was made from, how it had come to be, the very ethereal concern about what was the nature of being. We will not leave these concerns behind. They are important, and we will return to them in the works of other philosophers that we study in the future. But Socrates and his disciple Plato are much less interested in ontology, which is also called metaphysics or the study of being, than they are in things like ethics and politics. When the average person thinks about Socrates, they may misunderstand and imagine that he's discussing things up in the clouds, things distant from everyday concerns, but the opposite is true. Socrates is really the philosopher who discusses things that concern everyday people. He is not Hegel or Kant, spinning mysterious, huge volumes of text out of ethereal ideas about reason. Reading Plato is really something anyone can do, which anyone can set aside time for and should set aside time for. Now, getting back to the subject, in many ways, looking back on them, we would characterize the work of the pre-Socratics, the pre-Socratic philosophers. They're more like scientific speculation than what we would today call philosophy. The sophists, though, they were definitely involved in what we would call, from our modern perspective, philosophy. They call themselves sophistai, which translates as teachers of wisdom from the ancient Greek. They were itinerant, traveling around to share their wisdom in different Greek cities for a price. What exactly did they teach? Logic, rhetoric, public speaking, statesmanship, aka politics, and what meager sciences the Greeks possessed. They were not typically teachers of very young children, but rather wealthy men would pay sophists to either teach themselves or to teach their teenage and older sons how to carry themselves in public, how to speak, and most importantly, how to win arguments. That was the primary purpose of the logic element of their instruction. They wanted to teach men how to use logic, or maybe twist logic, to win arguments. Now, this is a particularly valuable skill in a democracy, especially in the type of democracy that the ancient Greeks typically practiced, in a society in which a large percentage of its citizens engage in lawmaking, in which trials are frequent, and in which the leading men of the state are called to pursue and defend their ideas in public forums. To sharpen the tools of your mind was a necessity if you wanted to get ahead in life, and if you wanted to hold your ground against some very ambitious, very conniving opponents. This was the milieu in which Socrates found himself when he began to pursue philosophy as well, presumably sometime during the Peloponnesian War. It is definitely important to remember that war when considering Socratic philosophy. Looking back, one cannot help but think that many ideas expressed in Plato's dialogues are really reactions to the decades of chaos and unrest caused by that war. Now, Socrates certainly set himself up as an opposing force to the sophists, but really, from our perspective, he is one of them. though Socrates certainly had characteristic focuses of his own. In particular, Socrates' thought was really derivative of that of Protagoras, another sophist. This Protagoras was the first philosopher that we know of who began to delve into the subjective side of things, to ponder thought itself. Whereas many prior thinkers had denied the value of sensation in determining truth, such as a lot of those pre-Socratics, Protagoras, like Socrates, believed that sensation was the only guide to truth. That is to say, that the exterior world may or may not be an illusion, depending on which philosopher you follow. So then, the senses, the perceptions of our mind, are the only things worth evaluating, the only things worth appreciating. They are the only things with which we can grapple. The sophists were also harbingers of a important cultural change occurring in Athens and elsewhere in the Greek world during this century. At the beginning of the 5th century BC, the era of the Persian War, the Oracle of Delphi was spoken of in the highest terms by poets and politicians, by everyone. Yet Herodotus, writing about that war, but at the middle of that century, makes mention of the oracle numerous times in his history of the war, but he's a little more timid and objective in his remarks about it. And then by the end of the century, we have Thucydides openly stating that people just used prophecies to fit whatever explanation or motives they already possessed. Athens and much of Greece was turning away from widespread embrace of ancient forms of divination and was instead becoming a rationalistic society. Plato himself, when discussing the origin of the universe, stated that the common opinion of his time was that all things derived from some spontaneous, unintelligent cause, which sounds a little like a non-scientific way of describing the Big Bang as seen by many people today, a spontaneous, unintelligent cause of all things. Now, rational as they may have been turning, there still was a strong religious sentiment among the average Athenians. The mysteries at Eleusis were still supremely important, and even Socrates embraced at least a nominal religiosity. He was of the opinion that all should do as the Oracle of Delphi had advised. When asked what is the proper way to worship the gods, the oracle had replied that every man should worship the gods according to the laws of his own country. But we should not promote the idea that the sophists were the cause of this societal change, this transformation, this growing skepticism of things mythological. They were simply another symptom of the overall cultural change, which was probably simply a result of the growing wealth of the Greek world. Remember, at the time of the Persian War, the Greeks were a hardy race of survivors, whose forefathers had come out of the Greek Dark Age with their stories about Zeus and Apollo and Demeter and Dionysius, with their animal sacrifices, with rudimentary economies and just above subsistence level of life. Remember also that in the great stories that they told, such as the Odyssey, that Odysseus fashioned his own bed and his wife, the queen, did her own work at the loom. These are hardly the activities of an effete power couple ruling over a decadent society. But when the Greeks defeated the Persians in the early 5th century BC, and they found themselves masters of the sea lanes, they began to receive wealth in quantities heretofore unimagined. Athens in particular, and with that wealth and that increasing familiarity with foreigners and their cultures, naturally there also came skepticism. Interestingly, the earliest sophists do not seem to have come from Athens, but rather are always depicted as visiting from other cities. Socrates appears to be among the first native to Athens who explores these new ideas, these subjective ideas. Yet he did not make himself rich off his ideas, though Socrates certainly had the opportunity. His relative poverty is remarked upon more than once in various places, though keep in mind, Socrates was probably wealthier than you or I. He must have had some sort of an estate that supported him and his wife and children without requiring him to work, which is much more than the average person has today. But it is true, he was not wealthy in terms of money, not when compared to many of his peers and his disciples, such as Plato, who was born into a wealthy family, and not when compared to contemporary successful sophists who were trading their teaching for money. His estate was enough to keep him and his family fed, and that was enough for Socrates. He preferred good conversation to wealth. He had his admirers and his detractors, but it is heartening to read the words of men who lived long after his death and had little in the way of selfish motives to continue lauding Socrates. Xenophon says of Socrates that he was, quote, so temperate that he never preferred pleasure to virtue, unquote. And he was so wise that, quote, he never erred in distinguishing better from worse. Plato, in a moving passage in the dialogue named Phaedo, declares that Socrates was truly the wisest and justest and best of all the men who I have ever known. What could have led the government of Athens in 399 BC to have executed a man who had earned such love from his fellow men? At the end of the sequence of episodes about the Peloponnesian War, I left the narrative in 404 BC with the death of Alcibiades at the hands of assassins sent by Sparta. At the war's conclusion, Athens was on its knees. The Spartans put a new government in place in Athens, a cabal remembered by history as the 30 Tyrants, although there were technically more than 30 men involved in this. Nevertheless, this was the ideal sought by Sparta for many years now. A weakened Athenian state, subservient to Sparta, and locally ruled by an oligarchy that could be relied on to toe the line and obey Spartan decrees. Remember that Sparta itself was technically ruled by 30 men, the Senate of 28 and the 2 kings. It didn't last for long, this new government in Athens. The 30 tyrants employed a police force to enforce their will. They brutalized their opponents, probably executed over 1,000 people, exiled more, and confiscated their possessions later. Needless to say, the willful, resilient Athenian populace, even after a decades-long war that ended in a devastating defeat, they rose up against this oppression. They were led by Thrasybulus, an exiled general who had been Alcibiades' right-hand man during the war. The leader of the 30 tyrants, a man named Critias, was killed during the battle. Critias had been an associate of Socrates. As for Socrates himself, he had never been exiled from Athens during this time, though he had been admonished by the oligarchy for his teachings. The fact that Socrates had not suffered death or exile during this period of oppression, but had instead been able to live in relative peace within the city, this would be an important factor in his trial a few years later, a trial held by men who had lost property and loved ones to the tyrants. The Spartans sent forces to defeat this new reborn democracy in Athens. In the Battle of the Piraeus, the Spartans, led by their king Pausanias and some allies from the old Peloponnesian League, defeated the Athenians again. But Pausanias, instead of reinstating an oligarchy, negotiated with the Athenians and allowed them to continue under democratic government, though they technically remained under Spartan oversight. For this and other reasons, after he returned to Sparta, Pausanias was put on trial, but that is content for another episode. Anyway, in 403 BC, Athens resumed its traditional democratic form of government. Those of the 30 tyrants who had not been killed in battle found asylum under Spartan protection in the holy city of Eleusis. In 401 BC, they would attempt, but fail, in a coup intended to renew the oligarchy. Now, there are less than 4 years between this resumption of democracy and the trial of Socrates. During that time, people who had cooperated with the 30 tyrants were, for the most part, amnestied, but that does not mean that they were forgiven. nor were their errors forgotten. Xenophon, another friend of Socrates, had been a cavalry commander under the 30 tyrants. By 401 BC, though Socrates discouraged him from this choice, Xenophon decided that it was wisest to get out of town, and he went off and became a mercenary working for Cyrus the Younger, the Persian prince in Anatolia, who had cooperated with the Spartans against Athens during the late war. This fact that a friend of Socrates went to work for the Persians also did not reflect well on the aging philosopher. Socrates, now approaching 70 years of age, still refused to leave town. He would hang on in Athens, and he would acquire a circle of admirers, as well as detractors, with whom he would regularly engage in discussions about a number of different topics, often scandalously undermining common presuppositions and prejudices that people held about these matters. Among his admirers was a wealthy young man named Plato, who had also served as a soldier in the last years of the Peloponnesian War. Interestingly, even Plato's identity remains a little mysterious. His name, Plato, is actually a nickname. The word really means plate, like dinner plate, and refers to his broad chest. The story we hear is that he was burly and a good wrestler, among other things, but also, obviously, he had the wit to become an accomplished writer. He spent the rest of his life writing dialogues with Socrates as his protagonist. Yet, much of Plato's dialogues about Socrates would appear to have this brief window of time, the immediate post-war era, as their setting, since Socrates was executed in 399 BC. And many of the names that you have heard and will hear in this episode appear in these dialogues as characters. Critias, for example, the leader of the 30 tyrants, appears in a couple of dialogues, including one named after him. Protagoras, the philosopher, also appears. Anytus, who would lay the capital charges against Socrates in the trial, would appear in the dialogues, and so would Aristophanes, the playwright, who would ridicule Socrates publicly. Now, it's good to know the politics that are the backstory and the setting for Plato's dialogues, but if your goal is to know Socrates, the best way is to get to know him is through reading these dialogues. And at the same time, this is also a terrible way to get to know Socrates, because most scholars would agree that the Socrates presented in the dialogues is probably little like the quote-unquote real Socrates, but then that can be said about any written material that depicts a historical figure. Everyone has their perspective. It is, though, true that Plato probably warps the real image of Socrates with something of a passion, because he is using the man to promote his own ideas, some of which ideas Socrates probably never held or espoused. Nevertheless, however much some of them may be contrived, there are still some dialogues that may best express the real views and character of Socrates. And I'm speaking here specifically of the 4 dialogues that give the accounting of the trial and death of Socrates. Now, centuries after the death of Socrates, a man named Thrasyllus edited the works of Plato and presented them in groups of 4, each group of 4 dialogues being called a tetralogy. This bears a curious resemblance to the way that the Greek playwrights wrote and presented trilogies of plays, 3 plays, always followed by a 4th satyr play. Now, Thrasyllus said that it was Plato himself who had actually organized the dialogues in these groups, but regardless of their origin, the entire corpus of dialogues that Thrasyllus presents consists of 36 dialogues in 9 tetralogies. I will post a copy of the list of the tetralogies on my website, western-traditions.org, on the page for this episode. Some of these dialogues are now considered specious, as things which Plato never wrote, but were rather composed by his followers or by people who simply used his name to promote the distribution and sale of their books. Anyway, interestingly, the first tetralogy in the list of Thrasyllus contains the dialogues about the end, not the beginning, of Socrates' life and career. These 4 dialogues are the Euthyphro, the Apology, the Crito, and the Phaedo. I propose to begin the investigation into Socratic philosophy with these dialogues. I think a decent argument can be made that these dialogues probably present more of the rudimentary original Socratic ideas that the actual man may have conceived and taught. As I mentioned before, other dialogues in the Platonic corpus of works obviously were written at much later dates and probably contain ideas that are wholly those of Plato, even though the author and loyal disciple rarely allowed any other speaker besides Socrates to act as the spokesman for his ideas. Furthermore, a guided, deep analysis of these initial dialogues, in which we investigate some of the habits and patterns of Socrates' questioning methods, should significantly help anyone to read the remaining dialogues on their own. Euthyphro is a male name in ancient Greece. It's derived from another word, euthys, meaning straight or direct. It is the name of the only character with whom Socrates engages in this dialogue. The dialogue begins with a setting description, the porch of the Archon Basilius, or King Archon. The King Archon was not a monarch at all, but his title was a holdover from the ancient days of the kingdom in Athens. In the political state of the time, 399 BC, he was simply one of the high officials in charge of certain state affairs, such as religious issues and certain judicial matters. As is the custom with virtually all the dialogues of Plato, the conversation simply starts right up. No introduction. Euthyphro asks Socrates, "Why are you waiting outside the office of the Archon Basilius?" Socrates explains that someone named Miletus has charged him with impiety. Specifically, that Socrates is a maker of gods, that he makes new gods and denies the old ones. Now, something important about the conversation so far and about all the dialogues. Socrates is always at pains to speak with supreme politeness to his interlocutors, even though sometimes you may note a silent taunt or jibe in his voice. Socrates never engages in any kind of bullying or fear tactics in his dialogue. He never tries to lord his intellect over his opponents. He frequently gives the other speakers multiple opportunities to explain themselves, to represent their ideas, even to adjust and edit their ideas without repercussion within the dialogue. There will be people in the dialogues who are not so kind, but Socrates worships conversation. He will never risk offending it with his own violations of etiquette. Now, Socrates, now that he has revealed his own reason for being present, he asks Euthyphro why he has come to the Archon Basilius. Euthyphro reveals that he is charging his own father with murder. Further, he describes how one of his family's field laborers got into a fight with one of their domestic servants and killed him. Then Euthyphro's father, enraged, bound the killer and threw him into a ditch before going off to seek counsel about what to do with the offender. In the meantime, cold and hunger and the chains upon the man, and by the way, these men involved are both slaves, and slavery was widespread in Athens, but this field slave thrown into a ditch, chained up, left in the cold, hungry, he died, and while he was waiting for justice. So Euthyphro has decided to take up the case against his own father and charge him with the murder of this slave, who committed a murder himself, but in the son's eyes, this man was unjustly handled while awaiting proper judgment. In his remarks, Euthyphro admits that this is an extraordinary situation, but that he seeks justice in the matter, even though some consider him impious for bringing charges against his own father. And the use of the word here, impious, and Euthyphro's response is what really kicks off the dialogue. Recall that Socrates was being brought up on charges of impiety. Now, I pronounce the word impious. You have a word pious, meaning holy or reverent, respectful, and the word impious. That is the way Americans pronounce it, and how I've pronounced it my whole life. The Brits pronounce it impious, which kind of makes more sense because it sounds like pious, impious, but I did just naturally call it impious because it's my habit. So we'll see what happens as we go through the podcast here, if I remember to stay within my American dialect. The aged philosopher then, Socrates, was about 70 years old at the time, and he asked Euthyphro to expound on these concepts, piety and impiety. And this is a key aspect of understanding not just Socrates in these dialogues, but in having any valuable philosophical discussion. You see, before he fully engages anyone in conversation, Socrates is always trying to discover what we call first principles. You see, it does not do us any good to have a conversation about something if we don't see eye to eye on the first principles of what we are supposedly talking about. If you and I begin to discuss, let's say, whether or not the death penalty was a just form of punishment, we would have to first determine what each of us means by the word just. What is justice? You might think that justice means receiving in turn the equivalent of what you have done to others. That is the kind of answer that will easily roll off anyone's tongue when first asked to define that word, justice. But what if I think that justice means receiving a consequence that is merited based on factors such as circumstances, character, mental capacity, remorse, and so on? In other words, what if I think that justice depends on a number of factors in an equation, but your equation for justice has fewer factors? Well, unless we two iron out exactly what justice is within the context of our conversation, it's very unlikely we'll ever agree. And even if we do agree, we won't really be in agreement. It'll just be an accident. We won't really be understanding one another. And if we disagree on the death penalty being just, we may completely misunderstand the other person and think that they're an idiot, they're a fool, they're incompetent, because in our minds, they simply can't complete the moral equation that's laid out simply in front of us. The problem is that the other person is completing a different equation. He's solving a different problem because you guys haven't agreed on your first principles. Unless, before we begin to discuss the death penalty, the two of us sit down to discuss the first things, the first principles, the very groundwork of our conversation, we're not going to get anywhere. Let us, in this case, mutually establish and agree on what the word just means before we go on to determine together if, say, the death penalty is just. This, in fact, will be the substance of more than one dialogue trying to determine what is just. If you're going to read Plato yourself, prepare to dig deep into the meanings of terms such as courage, beauty, good, justice, temperance, wisdom, and so on. Back to the dialogue, though. Euthyphro has been asked to define piety and impiety. He quickly answers, piety is doing what I am doing, prosecuting anyone who is guilty of murder, sacrilege, or any similar crime, whether they're your father or not. And not doing so is impiety. And to support his proposition, Euthyphro, like any good modern Christian, would backtrack to find some biblical passage to support his own idea. Euthyphro cites how even the gods themselves were willing to punish their own fathers for wrongdoing. Like Zeus bound up his own father Cronus, and even Cronus attacked his own father Uranus for his own evil deeds. This becomes a familiar setup to you as you progress through this and other dialogues on your own. Socrates asks for a definition of something, and you can count on the immediate answer to provoke a great discussion afterward. You may already yourself be finding some fault with Euthyphro's definition of piety and impiety. It's not required, but it's also not a bad idea at these junctures in the dialogues to propose your own answer to the question, and to consider how you or Socrates or someone else might poke holes in that definition. And poking holes in ideas is exactly what Socrates always gets to. It's this business about the gods that Socrates first addresses. Recall that the story about Cronus attacking his father, Uranus, Euthyphro does not mention it directly in the dialogue, but the story usually includes the castration of the father. So it's truly a lewd, salacious story. And yet, as Socrates will try to impress upon his listeners again and again, the gods, the divine world, they must be good, this must be beautiful, they must be above such disgraceful acts. So he asks Euthyphro if he thinks that these stories are true, because Socrates doesn't. When Euthyphro unhesitatingly replies yes and offers to elaborate on the wonderful deeds of the gods, Socrates declines the opportunity, and he redirects the conversation back to the question, what is piety and impiety? Piety, Euthyphro now says, is that which is dear to the gods, and impiety is that which is not dear to them. This is the sort of answer that I wanted, Socrates says. Indeed, these sorts of declarations are the meat of Socratic dialogue. They give you something to hang on to bounce ideas off of, something to adapt or throw away. It's not important, really, whether the statement is initially correct. It's only by jumping out there with an idea in the Socratic approach that you can then take the opportunity to examine the idea and determine if it's correct or not. Socrates now takes this idea that piety is what is dear to the gods and so on, and he begins to elaborate, to extrapolate, to bring in other things that are accepted truths and to try to make them all fit together and agree. Isn't it also true, he asks in paraphrase, that the gods have differences and hatreds among them? In other words, the gods are not always in agreement, right? Euthyphro assents to this. Anyone familiar with Greek mythology would. And Socrates points out how often differences among men, anyway, are usually solved by utilizing the right method of analysis, such as a disagreement about a number could be solved by turning to arithmetic, or a disagreement about the size of something could be solved through measurement by simply measuring the thing, putting the discussion to bed, or using a scale to determine the weight of something. Euthyphro agrees with Socrates that there are some things about which men cannot find an easy way to agree on, such as the matters of just and unjust, good and evil, and so on. We don't have easy ways to address these differences. It's obvious that we don't all agree on what's good, right? Furthermore, Euthyphro agrees that the gods must therefore have the same differences of opinion. They cannot agree on what is good and evil, just and unjust. Otherwise, they would always be in concord, but they are instead like men who disagree about what is good and evil. So some gods find one thing or one type of action good, and others think it is evil. So therefore, we go back to Euthyphro's proposition that piety is what is dear to the gods. This is not a satisfactory answer, as Socrates asserts, because it's clear that the gods do not agree about what they love and what they hate. So by punishing his father, Euthyphro might be doing what is pleasing to one god, but displeasing to another. This is a typical format for most dialogues of Plato. Socrates takes his companion's assertions about justice, piety, good, evil, courage, love, beauty, whatever, and begins to examine these ideas from all sides, as if they were objects with which he could get more familiar by viewing them from all vantages. And this is significant because Socrates, or Plato anyway, does seem to view all ideas as real in a way, almost as objects, imaginary objects, but having some sort of existence. Take, for example, love. Love can be a verb. It is something that we do. I love my children. You may love your father or your wife, etc. But this loving that we do, this love that we feel, is a projection of a real template, to use a familiar term. There's a master copy of love somewhere in some corner of reality. Love, capital L, capital O, capital V, capital E, love in its perfect, unmarred form exists. And it is only emulated in our actions. This is what Socrates would think anyway. Therefore, the same could be said for piety in this dialogue. There is a definition for piety somewhere. We may not know it, but Socrates is certain that it exists, and always he strives to discover these definitions of familiar concepts in his chats with his friends. Like Euthyphro, we run about in our daily lives, loving and hating, making decisions about what is good and evil, what is beautiful and ugly, but we are probably not actually getting it right. We are not expressing love according to the definition, the template, but rather we are basing it on a faulty model. And so, just like that, our piety is also an error. We must find these definitions, these templates of love, of piety, of good, of evil, of beauty, so that our day-to-day living can be more harmonious, so that slaves no longer die bound up in ditches and sons no longer have to chastise their fathers in court. Socrates desires, beyond getting the definitions right, for life to be harmonious like this. Remember, he lived through the frightful chaos of the Peloponnesian War, the various coups and counter-coups in Athens, the banishments, executions, imprisonments, oligarchy versus democracy, the war of brother against brother. Like many Athenians, Socrates and Plato and their companions, they were seeking through these philosophical efforts to not just bring back order and peace to society, but to bring perfect order, perfect justice, perfect piety, perfect love. And to do so, they must find the true meanings of all these ideas. Now, Socrates does not get into all this philosophy in the way that I just expressed it exactly. Sort of, he doesn't get into it didactically in the Euthyphro. Socrates prefers to tell stories. He's much more entertaining than I am. I recommend, of course, that you read the Euthyphro on your own and that you're prepared to read it both casually and slowly. Casually, because these are conversations and one can easily imagine taking part in them, but also slowly, because there are times, even in documents like the Euthyphro, times in which Socrates asks you to focus down so incredibly pinpointedly on a particular idea, to really take apart a concept like piety or like justice or courage, to break it down into its most fundamental elements so that you can't simply breeze through. Sometimes it's a good idea to stop in the middle of a dialogue, whenever Socrates challenges you to think this way, and to walk away and let yourself think about the ideas that you just read. It's sort of like breaking down an engine or a weapon or a tool or some piece of equipment that you use and you're cleaning or repairing it. You got to lay everything out on the floor of your garage, maybe on top of towels, right? And strip it down completely. The nuts and the bolts all pulled out and set down and the grease cleaned off. And you get ready to try to put the whole thing back together from square one. And this time you're going to meditate on every single piece as you put it all back together. And you're going to recreate the original equipment, but this time it's going to be perfect. You're going to achieve perfection. And that takes time. You can't breeze through that. That is what Socrates does with ideas. That is what he does with love and beauty and piety. So don't be afraid in reading Plato to simply put the book down in the middle of a dialogue. Let yourself digest, process what is being said. Go off to work, or take a walk, or have a meal with friends and family, and ruminate on the idea before picking up the book again. This is especially wonderful if you can come to Plato in the extracurricular environment, say as an adult, already in the world working. These are ideas that you can stop and discuss with family, with friends, with coworkers. And the beautiful thing is that your companions in conversation do not have to be quote unquote well educated to talk with you about these things. The ideas and conversations of Socrates are not elevated discussions out of the reach of the quote unquote average mind. These are things anyone can talk about. A lawyer can discuss these things intelligently with an electrician, a doctor with a plumber, a professor with a crane operator. I've had conversations about Socratic ideas with Central American farm workers with grade school educations. These are straightforward ideas, though their implications are profound. Are things inherently good? Is something just because we say it's just, or is it just fundamentally? One of the more important things that Socrates gets across in the dialogue, and it's more profound than you might think when you just read it the first time, is this idea that things which are holy, because they're talking about the gods here, right? Things which are holy are not holy because the gods love them, but rather the gods love things that are holy. Now, I'm not making a religious stance here. This is not really about religion. It's not about holiness, just as the dialogue is not really about piety. There is something really fundamental to Platonic thought being expressed here. Holiness is just the example for this particular dialogue. The reason for all this focus on holiness and piety is simply because Socrates is about to be judged for impiety. But let's think about this idea. Things do not derive their holiness from the love of the gods. Something isn't holy simply because the gods love it. It's the other way around. Instead, things are actions. Things are actions such as sacrifice or respect for parents or obedience to the laws. These things have an intrinsic holiness which the gods therefore respect. You can apply this to many different subjects. Something is good or holy or beautiful intrinsically, not because God declares it so. It's the other way around. God approves of something, say love for your children, because that love is already good. The goodness of it pre-exists God's approval. This is counter to the way that many people view many different subjects, and not just religion, but in law and many other matters. People not just in the same religion, but in the same country or in the same culture may find themselves in surface agreement about things, but really be at odds fundamentally without even knowing it. For the sake of familiarity, take one of the 10 Commandments. You might say that it is wrong to steal because God said so. It's right there in the text, right? Thou shalt not steal. So that's why we don't steal. God says it's bad, and therefore it is. Another person, perhaps Socrates, might see this and say, no, 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 no. Stealing is evil, so God forbids it. This is not a case of splitting hairs, as philosophers can often be accused of doing. This speaks to a fundamental philosophical difference between people, something which they may go through their whole lives without recognizing. Something is good on its own, Socrates is saying, not because the gods say so. Rather, men and the gods recognize the goodness pre-existing in something, and they value that. So murder is evil intrinsically, not simply because the gods forbid it. This understanding is going to permeate Socratic thought as you progress through the dialogues. And it's important to recognize that you or people you know may not agree with you on this one. You may think that making something legal automatically makes it good. You would be in agreement then, whether you think so or not, with those men in Socrates' time who thought that things were holy or pious because the gods said so, not due to some fundamental holiness. Whereas another person might say, let's say, slavery was once legal, but it was wrong. It doesn't matter what the law said or says. Things are either right or wrong fundamentally, and the laws of gods and men have no impact on that fundamental goodness of or evil of things. The conversation with Euthyphro ends in frustration, as do many of the dialogues. Do not read Plato expecting to find answers. I'm not saying that you won't find any answers at all, but what Socrates does more than anything, and this is purposeful, Socrates finds the right questions. This is why Socrates will insist again and again that he does not know anything. He's not like the other sophists who will charge you to reveal their wisdom, their answers to you. He wants to help you, and for you to help him, to find the right questions, because we can't find the right answers if we're asking the wrong questions. Asking the wrong questions can only lead us to the wrong answers every time. Only once we find the right questions do we have any hope of getting good answers. Now, what is the purpose of getting good answers, you might ask? That is an important question itself, a question dear to Socrates, a question we will seek the answer to in future dialogues. Because ultimately, Socrates, or maybe really Plato using Socrates as his representative, they seek the answers to these questions because the long-term goal of all these dialogues is a society that works, a society that functions perfectly to everyone's satisfaction. Ultimately, all these pretty philosophical dialogues, these amusing turns of conversation, the frustrating and sometimes bewildering examinations of familiar concepts, all this is intended to help us in the end to discover the right way to govern ourselves. Yes, the ultimate goal of Socrates and his disciple Plato and many of their followers is to design and establish a perfect government and a harmonious society. And actually, this goal, this idea, is controversial in their time, in post-Peloponnesian War Athens, because there is a government, a cherished authority, a long-standing tradition of administration over Athens, over the city for which men have fought and died, and for which their women and children have also suffered death and been sold into slavery. But when we come to Plato's Republic, we shall see that Socrates has some very distinct ideas about good government that set him at odds with the culture of his time. We will hear more about why Socrates came to be regarded as dangerous to the state in the next episode, about the trial before the assembly of 500 in Athens in 399 BC. Until then, I thank you for listening to the Western Traditions Podcast.